Alrighty, friends, I'm excited for today's topic. It may get a little bit exciting, a little bit controversial. I love the episodes where I get to be really actionable and practical with you, like our episode last week when we talked about wheat berries and all of that. I also love the episodes where I can get a little more high level and we can look at different trends and patterns in the homestead movement. I have a vested interest in the movement because I was one of the first people to start talking about this online. I'm not saying I invented it by any means, right? But I had one of the first homestead blogs, one of the first people to start doing all these crazy old-fashioned things publicly. So I'm always interested in patterns and trends and perceptions and where things are going. And I've seen a big pattern emerge lately, mostly through conversations I've had online and in person. But it's a little bit concerning to me. Primarily because what I'm seeing happen is people are being actively pushed away from the homestead movement and the idea of growing their own food and being a creator versus a consumer and living more intentional because somehow, thank you, internet, that idea of skills and that group of concepts has somehow become tangled up in the idea of conspiracy and paranoia. And I even had someone say, hey, I didn't listen to your podcast forever because I just assumed that you fell into that bucket. And then, I listened to it, I realized you don't, and it was so refreshing, blah, blah, blah. But I'm like, how many other people are feeling drawn, like intrinsically, like we know humans are supposed to be drawn into this idea of being more connected to land, community, and themselves. But this new connotation around the homestead lifestyle is making them go, no, thank you. So I want to break this down today. I think it's important. I have some thoughts for you and probably some surprising revelations that you might not see coming. So let's do this. So welcome to Old Fashioned on Purpose. This is the show where we explore what we have left behind as we have raced towards progress and how we can reclaim all the good parts and weave them into our modern day-to-day. I'm your host, Jill Winger, and way back in 2008, I bought a tumble-down farmstead that nobody wanted with my husband out here on the wide open Wyoming prairie, and we turned it into a homestead bit by bit and piece by piece. And we have now the privilege of getting to teach all those skills and all the things we learned to the rest of the world. And that's what I now do here on the podcast, my blog, and on my social media accounts. So I have a pretty cool gig, and I'm really thankful for it. So been in this world a long time. I've seen homesteading go through a lot of iterations. I remember back in the day when I didn't even know how to describe to people what I did, because I'd be like, I have a garden and I have chickens and I have a milk cow. And they're like, what? That's weird. And they would be like, are you doing this commercially? And I'm like, no, it's personal food production. And they're like blank, like no comprende, didn't get it. And so I've loved the term homesteading. It's an imperfect term. It confuses people sometimes. And I've talked about this on the show before. But I still think it's the best way I've found just to encapsulate someone who's living old-fashioned. You're growing your own food. You're not necessarily selling it, but you're just trying to get back to basics and return to your roots. And homesteading is just an easy way to try to wrap that up in a single word, even though it does have some weaknesses. And sometimes people think you're doing it on free government land or whatever. But whatever, you know what I mean? It's just a nice word to describe what people like you and I do. So it's concerning to me that there's a shift around this term because words do matter, right? And I even found myself, even though my business has traditionally been branded all over the place with the word homestead, the Prairie Homestead, and my courses all have the word homestead in them, I've kind of started using it less because it makes me a little bit uncomfortable sometimes that people just lump it together with a certain set of beliefs. So before I get any further, I want to say, we're going to talk a lot about conspiracy theories and those sorts of ideas today. I don't like the us versus them mentality. I'm not doing this episode to try to create division. If you are someone who tends to believe in more of those things, you follow more of those things online, and that's your motivations for homesteading, you're still welcome here. I'm not trying to kick you out of my communities or say you're stupid or say you're not welcome. Like, you're still welcome here. That's my point today, is not to create these, us versus them, but rather I just hope that it will help you ask some questions and be curious and think through things in a different way. And maybe at the end of this, you'll have the same beliefs and same ideas and nothing will have changed. But as long as you've just consciously thought through what you believe and why you believe it, I think that's a really important exercise in all of our life, not just about today's topic. So that's my caveat. I'm not kicking anybody out. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm not trying to create a war. I just am hopeful we can come to this topic with an open mind. So I would say since COVID, I mean, not surprisingly, that's when this started. And I think it started then for good reason. There is an increase with people coming to homesteading for potentially different motivations than they did 10 years ago, right? It used to be all about the food, and now we have people really flooding into the movement. We've seen so much more interest around homesteading after COVID just because things felt so shaky and so weird, and we had supply chain shortages. All of those are very normal reasons that people go back to the land. We've seen that historically during the Great Depression. We've seen it in the 1970s. If you have my book, Old Fashioned on Purpose, I talk about this. Like, this is a normal human response to when our human structures feel out of whack. So I am not surprised that homesteading grew. But what I also saw really change during that period is there was a lot of people coming to it with a very fear-based and almost a paranoid mindset. And again, I get it. COVID, with the weird things that happen in government and the authoritarianism, and it was bizarre, the stuff that went down, and it made everybody question authority and question our leaders, and everything felt, like we couldn't trust anyone anymore. So I understand. But what I see now 4 years later is that fear and paranoia is still at an all-time high. And it has started to really seep into all areas of the homestead movement, or more areas than it used to. We used to just have a few people on YouTube or whatever that were really speaking to that, and the rest of the world was like, meh. But now I'm seeing more and more creators, whether it's on social media or YouTube or blogs, like really diving in deep. And I think that's what's really causing people to be turned away from the movement. If they don't buy into all of those theories, then they feel like, I don't belong here. These people aren't for me. And I've even seen some of those people who believe in the theories really get aggressive. They've been aggressive towards me, actually, among, not to mention other people, when we don't buy into this set of beliefs. So I even had someone the other day, and this is really what prompted this episode. I posted about how, you can homestead out of different motivations and fear. And she's like, it was kind of condescending. She's like, aha, whatever. Obviously you're new here. You'll catch on eventually. Kind of alluding to the fact that I hadn't thought through it yet. And that's why I don't believe this set of conspiracies yet. And so it got me to thinking, and I'm actually like, it's actually the opposite that's true. The reason I don't buy into the same set of conspiracies and this fear that I see that's so prevalent right now is because I've actually been there, done that, and got the t-shirt already. I actually grew up in a culture that was very motivated to this end. We weren't homesteading, but everyone around me believed that the end of the world was coming very, very soon. So that was a topic of conversation. There was a lot of suspicion and distrust of government woven in there. I'm not saying that that's always a bad thing. I think the government kind of just is not great a lot of the time. And when humans get into power, things get wonky. So I'm not saying that's all bad, but that's kind of the culture I was raised in. Back when I was a younger girl, one of our Sunday night activities, we'd go to church in the morning and come back for church in the evening. Like, we would watch different documentaries occasionally as a church, and a lot of them were about this end of the world phenomenon, and it would depict all of these horrible things that were going to befall people. And I remember one where people's heads were getting chopped off and families were being torn apart, and there was mass killings and black helicopters. Like, we were all sitting there, these little girls in dresses, watching these documentaries in church. So many nightmares after that. Like, and I've talked to so many other people who watched similar things in the 90s. That was like a 90s church culture thing. I'm not really sure why, but persistent nightmares after that. As a teenager, we prepped for Y2K because we didn't know it was going to happen, which, I don't feel like that's all bad, but we had buckets of rice and beans in our basement, and we watched the TV as it started to hit midnight around the world, and we were waiting for all the lights to go out and all the technology to go away. And even the area of North Idaho where I grew up, like, a ton of people moved to that area to live in the woods, and they made bunkers and forts and all sorts of structures because they thought Y2K was the end of the world. And so we were ready, and it felt normal to me to prepare for that. It also was a little anticlimactic when we realized, like, oh, well, these places all hit midnight, nothing happened. So moving on, life is normal again. But even after I moved away from home, I still just was constantly surrounded by people who believed this end of the world was imminent. And even people, and I saw this a lot, and I think it's hard for people to admit this, but like they were kind of hoping it would happen because then they could, shoot. They would always say, I'm going to shoot the UN peacekeepers. And I don't really know where they got that, but that was like a big thing. And I have my bunker and I have my guns and I'm going to do this. And if someone tries to take away my guns, this is what I'm going to do. And there was like this, what we would talk about that over lunch. Like it was a normal topic of conversation. Like, obviously this is happening soon. And now I can kind of do whatever I want and justify whatever actions because it's the end of the world and there is no rules anymore. And again, that was normal to me. And I was constantly surrounded by that. So I've seen a lot of different conspiratorial beliefs come and go throughout the decades. And it's funny because the ones that were such a big deal back in the 90s that felt so eminent are now like forgotten. And now we have a whole new set of conspiratorial beliefs that we think are like the thing, and they're so real and they're so accurate. And I think the biggest thing that kind of started to pull me out of that culture and really changed my mind is just seeing how cyclical it was, right? And seeing that, oh, well, we all believed that thing to happen then, but it didn't. And now we're on to a new thing. And it's just like kind of replacing one for the other. And when you start to understand those cycles, not just of those sorts of beliefs, but just about economies and nations and governments in general, it's kind of reassuring in an odd way. And I think one of our biggest issues right now as a culture, because we're all kind of wound up tight right now, I think that our worldview is so tiny. And we have this idea that we're like the most important time in history, and it all is pivoting around our little era, which is so short in the grand scheme of things. And when we start to get hyper-focused like that, our perspective gets pretty skewed. We think our era is just so novel and so unprecedented, and it's actually not. It's pretty precedented, if you want to be honest. So one of the ways that I've really educated myself about this has been through books. You guys know I love to read. Here's a few examples if you guys wanted to dig into this a little deeper. So I'm right now listening to a book called Pale Rider by Laura Spinney, and it's about the Spanish flu, the 1918 flu epidemic. Fascinating. So fascinating. I mean, she has lots of anecdotes in there, but like the part that just blew my mind was just she was talking about the government response to the flu, the people's response to the flu, the conspiracies that people created around the flu because it was scary and it was, bizarre to them. And honestly, it was so dead on. I stopped the audiobook, and I went Google to see when it was written. Because I'm like, okay, she had to have written this after COVID, and she's trying to prove a point about COVID. Nope, it was written in 2017. So it could have been a playbook of what happened during COVID. They even had a fight back in 1918 or whenever about what to call it. And they were the Spaniards are mad. They called it the Spanish flu. And then other countries were trying to call it a flu from another country to point names. If you remember, we did the same thing with COVID and arguing about what country it came from and what we should name it and if it was offensive, right? Like down to that. We've been here before, not to mention viruses themselves are cyclical. And we can see throughout history, as little as we have recorded, that there have been viruses that go through and wipe out masses of the population. And that just happens in humanity. It's just a thing that happens, and it happens more now because we are so connected as a culture and we travel, and it doesn't take any time at all for it to pass across the world. Now, I know there's lots of debate on where the virus came from. I'm not wanting to get into that today. That is really a moot point. My point is that the response to the virus, which we feel like was so insane, I will admit it felt insane. There were parts about it I didn't like, and I've talked about that publicly. Didn't approve with how the governments responded to that, but it's an echo of what has happened in the past. And I remember so many times we all said, this is unprecedented. And I'm like, actually, it was precedented. It's an election year. Everyone is obsessed with the election. It's all people want to talk about. It's completely consuming their focus. I was Googling prior elections that were super dramatic, and go Google the 1828 election between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Kind of hilarious. Like epic mudslinging. I think maybe even more mudslinging than we have now. Like they were making jokes about each other's moms and their wives being fat, and like it was just like unbelievable. You'd think that people like John Adams and Andrew Jackson would have a little more couth, but no, it was rolling around in the mud, doing whatever it took to try to win the election, playing super dirty. Everyone's super wound up about interest rates right now. I get it. They're high. You're trying to buy a homestead. It's frustrating. We've actually really recently seen high interest rates before, 1980s, right? I think I was Googling. They were up to 16, 17%, I think is the highest they got. And then they came back down and they go back up, come back down. Like that's the cycle of economics and culture. The cycles happen a lot, right? So I think if we can kind of see our place in human history as a speck on a timeline instead of like this magnifying glass, hyper-focused on every little detail, I think it helps. I'm not saying it will make our day-to-day that much easier because the reality is the reality. We're going to have another wonky election this year. We have high interest rates. Flus and viruses happen. But I think for me, it gives me some solace to know, hey, this has happened before. I'm part of the bigger cycle. If you want some reading to get into this a little deeper, there's 2 books. They're not easy reads. They are books you have to really chew your way through. But there's The Changing World Order by Ray Dalio. I will admit some of the parts where he gets into the super financial stuff, I zone out. So I fast forwarded. But the man's brilliant with an incredible perspective of governments and economies and how they cycle. There's another one called The Sovereign Individual by James Dale Davidson. Again, not an easy read, but talks about cycles back from kind of when we started recorded history, when the Industrial Revolution came. Now we have the technological revolution, and he talks about the transitions of power in government and all of that. Fascinating. Also just, gives me some peace to know that it's happened before and it's happened again. So I tell you all this, not because I don't believe that we could be facing some shaky times in America. I think that's possible. We felt the shakiness during COVID, and it could still be continuing. I have food in my basement. If you watch my YouTube videos, I've showed you my bulk food storage. I was so thankful to have that during COVID. I didn't see supply chain shortages coming, and they did. And I was so grateful that I had wheat berries and a grinder and coconut oil and salt in bulk. I didn't have to go to the store. It's not like we would have, run out of food and starved otherwise, but I just didn't have to go to the store. I didn't have to worry about it. It was so awesome and so reassuring. Christian and I have our assets and our finances set up in a way that kind of no matter what the economy does, we're cushioned, right? It might not mean our businesses are thriving in a certain year if we're in the middle of a recession, but we have our assets organized, and we have enough cushion, and we have enough diversification in what we're doing that if one part tanks, it's not going to just break us overnight, right? So we do think about this. Christian and I are very much minded to be prepared. What I love about homesteading, and I've preached this from the rooftops, is the best part of this lifestyle is when you can sink into it and learn the skills and do the things just for your own enjoyment and pleasure, and because you love the food and you love the land and you love the community. The side effect of that is that you are prepared for whatever life throws at you. You are more stable, you are more resilient, and you're not losing sleep and having high blood pressure because of the fear and the panic. And that's what I have seen happen in some of the circles I have run with prior in a previous life, is those people who built their entire lives on paranoia and conspiracy. It affected them physically after a while. It made them physically ill. You could see it in their bodies. You could see it in their face. I mean, it makes sense, right? If you feel like you're going to have UN peacekeepers, for lack of a better word, I'm just using that because that's what people used to say, come to your door at any day and take your children and your guns. Yeah, I'm not going to sleep super well either. But I think we have to be honest with ourselves that maybe we're just working ourselves up a little much. So be prepared. Think ahead. Be wise. But that doesn't mean you have to be paranoid. Another thing that's kind of helped me shift out of this belief system of conspiracy or maybe even paranoia that I carried as a younger person was just kind of understanding how our human brains work, right? And it makes sense when you start to understand those pieces, why people are so easily kind of seduced into movements, whether it's conspiratorial movements or it's other movements. And we have some weaknesses in our brain that sometimes these beliefs kind of capitalize on. So a big one, and you probably are familiar with this one, is confirmation bias, right? Another way to phrase it is if you look for something, you will find it. And this works in so many places in your life. We like to find information that is consistent with our existing beliefs, right? We all do that. It feels good to us. So, for example, I recently read the book Bad Therapy by Abigail Shrier. It's not on this topic at all. It's about parenting and kind of this epidemic of kids not wanting to grow up and being stunted. Loved the book. But one of the big reasons I love the book is because it validated what I already believed about child rearing. So I love that there's evidence. I love that she's speaking to it, but I had to be honest with myself. I'm like, you liked it a lot because she's a brilliant woman, but also you kind of already agreed with it, right? So I asked myself a lot with my beliefs of all kinds. Okay, I love reading things that make me feel good about what I already think, but what can I read that's going to challenge what I think? That doesn't mean I just flip-flop sides all the time, but it means I'm being open-minded and not falling into that confirmation bias trap. One of the scariest parts about social media, and this has totally happened to me, the algorithms are set up for confirmation bias. I do not believe this is a government plot. I believe it is a plot by corporations to make more money on social media. So once the algorithms learn what you like and learn what makes you react, whether it's a like, a share, or a comment, they're going to show you more of that thing. The algorithms are smart enough to do that. They do it all the time. So if you like a post let me think of an example that's not too dicey here. If you like a post about giant green lizards living under the Yellowstone volcano, then they're going to show you another post of that same theme. And you like that one, and they show you more because they want to keep you liking and commenting. And what happens to you is you start to go, oh my gosh, everyone believes there are giant green lizards living under the Yellowstone volcano. We are in the majority. This has to be right. This is the only way to think about this. This is the only way to believe, which isn't really the case. And it's probably a very small percentage of people who actually believe that. And there's probably a lot of other evidence that opposes that, but you're not being shown that because of the algorithms. So that's a weakness, maybe not even a weakness of social media. They definitely did that on purpose. Again, not to try to hurt our brains, but to try to make more money for their corporations. But we need to understand that we can get skewed really fast thanks to confirmation bias. Another principle that is helpful here, when you start to get wrapped up or worried about events or things happening and you're watching YouTube videos and they're claiming that there are these motivations for this thing and all these scary things happening, that just flat out, not everything is a conspiracy. And that's one thing that's concerning me right now is I do think there are people in government that don't have our best interests in mind. I do think that power corrupts. I do think that you just look at the systems of government, whether it's the Roman Empire or anywhere else in the world over thousands of years, like bad stuff happened. Governments get just toxic real quick. So that's not a conspiracy, right? Big government corrupts. But when we start to see every little thing that happens in our culture, every Facebook outage, every time, that a food plant burns, I'm going to get a lot of hate mail over that. So just hear me out. If we see every single thing as a conspiracy, that can kind of get us into that world of paranoia, right? The Occam's razor principle is one to familiarize yourself with. And what Occam's razor says is the simplest explanation that will account for a circumstance or an event is most likely the correct one. I'm not saying always, but it's most likely the correct one. So could a chicken plant burn down because it was foul play? Yep. And there could be this incredibly complex web of people who report to the president, and the president hates us and he wants to starve Americans. And then he hires these people in like black sweatsuits and they go in and they burn the chicken plant and then they make it look like this and that. And then they, stage it so it looks like an accident. That could happen. I don't have enough firsthand evidence to prove otherwise. But is it also possible that factories are pretty complex and have a lot of moving pieces and some wiring hadn't been updated and it caught on fire? Because that happens a lot. That's also possible. So again, not speaking to one or the other as being the answer. I'm just saying let's be open-minded enough to consider the more obvious possibilities or the most obvious solutions sometimes. And then the other psychological principle I wanted to bring to your attention, and this is one you've probably heard of before in concept, but maybe not in title. So it's called the Bader Meinhof phenomenon, or the frequency illusion. Sounds fancy. It's really not. What this is simply that phenomenon that your brain does to you. You buy a new car and all of a sudden you see everyone else driving that same car. And you're like, oh my gosh, they're copying me. I have the most popular car in the world. We all kind of laugh about that because we know that's not the case. We just know that now our brains are calibrated to see that car because you weren't aware of it before. Before you just ignored it, right? It's happened to me so many times in so many things. It kind of goes back to that confirmation bias. When you look for it, you will find it. And so if you start to look for conspiracies and all these crazy signs to tie together and all of that, you're going to find it. One of the silliest examples is years ago, I did a YouTube video and I did something with my hands. I don't even remember what I did, but I had people commenting on the post. They're like, she's a part of the Illuminati because the way she's holding her hands. And I'm like, wow. I didn't know I was a part of the Illuminati, but I also maybe just accidentally figured out their secret hand symbols. If that's the case, they really need to work on some better secret hand signals. But if we start to look for it, we're going to find it. When you're hyper-focused to watch someone's hand symbols or signals, then you're going to see it everywhere. I can assure you definitively that I am not a member of the Illuminati, FYI, just so you know. I'm sure that's what they all say, but just putting that out there. So anyway, we have confirmation bias, we have Occam's razor, and we have this frequency illusion. And it's just important to know our brains are wired to play tricks on us sometimes. That's just part of being human. We all do it. We all been there, done that, right? And just be aware of that. Again, it might not change your mind. And I do know that probably not going to change anybody's mind from this episode. I know if you believe what you believe, you're probably going to stick with that. But what I do hope that happens is that you just maybe hold your beliefs with a slightly open hand. You're willing to ask questions, and maybe you go through that process and you still come out the other side with the same beliefs, or maybe not. But I think that process is so healthy, and it can grow us so much and help us mature as humans to just ask better questions and be curious instead of being stuck in our ways. So I don't know what the next 10 years holds. I'm not predicting anything. I feel like I'm ready for whatever, good or bad. It would seem that according to the books I've read, the different cycles of empires and nations, America could be on a decline of sorts. I'm not saying it's a World War III situation necessarily. I don't really think that it's a top secret group of people who are living in a bunker somewhere, orchestrating everything like puppets. That just doesn't feel plausible. But I do think that governments have a life cycle, and people tend to get corrupted by power. And I think that corporations are motivated by profits. And I think we bring all those things together, just things crumble after a while. So again, I don't think it necessarily means that we're going to be occupied by a different country or it's World War III. But I think that the economy could be a little rocky, little recession-y for a while, or things might feel a little rough with this election. But I don't lose sleep over that because I know we're prepared, and we homestead out of love, not fear. And I think that's really important. And that is going to help you enjoy what you're doing in your kitchens and your gardens with your animals in your barn so much more than coming at it from a place of the sky is falling. So I want to encourage you today that even if you've dabbled in a little bit of that conspiratorial thinking, you felt your heart beat a little faster when you're watching videos or reading posts online, I'm going to invite you to step away from that. Because here's the deal. You can wind yourself up and feed your brain a constant diet of that, and then you're going to see it everywhere. Or, odds are you watching a YouTube video about it isn't going to change what happens anyway. So here is my invitation for you as we wrap up this episode. The world's going to do what the world's going to do, regardless of how many YouTube videos you watch about the end of the world or whatever else may be happening. And all that happens when we feed our brains a constant diet of that is it works us up, it raises our blood pressure, and it makes us start to see the bad things everywhere because we start to look for it. So you can choose to live like that in a heightened state of fear, or you can choose to say, you know what, it's going to happen, what's going to happen. And I can still love this homestead lifestyle and grow food and connect with my neighbors and build healthy soil and create in my kitchen for my own motivations, out of love for all of those things, out of joy and out of passion. The results of what you create and produce on your homestead will probably be the same. You'll just be a lot happier in the process, and you'll still be prepared no matter what the world may throw at us. So I hope that was encouraging for you today, friends. Again, if you are more of the conspiracy crew than I am, cool. You're welcome here. I hope you enjoy my content. I'm not trying to ostracize or push aside. I just want to keep our movement where it is wholesome and welcoming to folks of all walks of life, regardless of what they believe about the end of the world, because there's so much good here. There is so much good for all humans, and all humans need this, not just a certain group. So I will keep preaching that till the cows come home. So that's all I got for you today. Thank you so much, and we will chat on the next episode of the Old Fashioned on Purpose podcast.